a lot of work in economics and psychology suggests that our beliefs are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? If you believe in somebody, you will put faith in them. They will see that you've put faith in them and they will step up. It's what's known as earned trust in economics. If you invest money in somebody else and they have the chance to pay you back, the more you invest in them, the more percentage of that investment that they'll pay back to you. The return on investment of trust is enormous because people reciprocate. And if we instead decide, man, everybody's out to get me or just out for themselves, I'm going to just hold back, I'm not going to trust people, other people can tell that you're feeling that way. They can tell in the distant ways that you respond to them and in the little faith you put in them. And if people reciprocate trust, they retaliate against mistrust. So I think to myself, not just what am I giving up when I don't trust, but what good could I do for this person? What good could I bring out of them if I choose to take a chance instead? Just that little leap of faith.
Dr. Jamil Zaki, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being a guest.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. There are going to be a handful of people who listen and or watch the show who might not be familiar with your work. We are a culture-hungry bunch, so a lot of people will be. But for the handful who are not familiar with you or your work, I'm wondering if you can start us off by just orienting us around the work that you do.
Of course. I'm a behavioral scientist, so my lab and I use tools from psychology, economics, sociology, neuroscience, even a little bit of philosophy sprinkled in there to understand how people connect with each other, what those connections do for us, and how we can learn to connect better. So I do that here. I'm a professor at Stanford. I've been here for 12 years. I direct the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. And when I'm not writing about human connection for other psychologists, in my spare time, I write about human connection for non-psychologists, for everybody who's interested. So it's a deep passion of mine and has been basically my entire life.
Well, that's how I came to know your work. We have some shared colleagues, some shared network overlap, but I am and have been overtly on a mission against cynicism for essentially my entire adult life. In my previous company, I used to stand up in front of them all the time and say, no room for it. And yet when you talked about just a moment ago, writing for, academics and or writing for the rest of us, that is the topic of your newest book. And so broad question here, was your interest in cynicism and or connection, as you put it, more broadly, was that really a downstream, topic that you became interested in? Because it seems like we're coming out of what has been arguably the most disconnected and potentially the most cynical sort of era of, certainly my short life. I mean, I am 19, so I've been around a long time. But it just, how did this area of focus and interest come about for you? Was it a downstream effect of culture at large, or was this something you've been curious about, interested in for a long time, and it just happened to coincide with popular culture?
Well, first of all, Chase, you don't look a day over 17 and a half. So
thank you so much.
They say in psychology that research is me-search. That is, you come to a big idea because it's interesting, but really because it's meant something to you in your life. And that's certainly been true of my work on compassion, empathy, and kindness. Being sort of from this multicultural background, trying to connect across difference was always a part of my life, going back to my early childhood. So I became interested in human connection as a sort of personal journey. And that's true of my interest in cynicism as well. For 20 years now, I've been studying, like I said, empathy, social support, pro-social behavior like generosity and kindness. And I've kind of become, through that work, an unofficial ambassador for humanity's better angels. People often ask me to come and speak or write for them so that they can feel good about our species, about who we are. And trust me, I believe the science. I do the science. I know that what people fundamentally want is to be with each other and to be there for each other. I know that we are nourished by our connections to one another, and that's who we truly are. But knowing something and feeling it are not always the same thing. And my secret this entire time, well, it's not a secret anymore, of course, I reveal it in the book, is that even though I study human goodness, in my personal life, I've always had a hard time perceiving it and experiencing it. I tend to be cynical myself. I tend to suspect people. I tend to have a hard time trusting people. I tend to get pretty gloomy about the human race. And for me, that really crested in the early pandemic. As you said, we were all so disconnected, mediated by our screens. And I just felt this major split between what I was writing about, talking about, and studying and what I was experiencing as a human being. And I thought, well, man, if I am drowning in cynicism, given what I do for a living,
You're the expert.
how is everybody else doing? And that brought me into this big topic. And I just discovered so much I felt was urgent to share as much as I could with as many people as I could.
Well, timeliness, as they say, is everything, and it couldn't have come at a better time. I would say for me personally, and my, it, it, let's just talk about, we're on the back side of this pandemic, politically more divided than ever before, largely because of technology, information moving quickly, the advantages that we think we know and the disadvantages that it doesn't actually help us. Science says knowing about all the natural disasters that are happening 10,000 miles from you, or, the fact that the violent crime rate is down, yet our perception of it is that it's radically up. All of these things, they have a tremendous effect on us. I will share personally that I did not, I'm an extroverted introvert. Actually, I'm an ambivert, largely extroverted, and yet I was an only child, so I need to go back to my room and play with Legos every once in a while and recharge. And I did not think that the pandemic was affecting me. My wife is an introvert. She was on cloud nine. I mean, it's horrible that we're experiencing such loss and pain as a culture. And man, I was always overstimulated. So the difference that we experienced in our household was it became extreme over time. And I haven't realized until I started going out and trying to socialize again, I lost my skills. I lost my ability to connect more naturally. That was never an effort for me. It was just very natural. I sought it out. And then all of a sudden, these are skills that I'm having to wait a minute. I didn't know that this was a thing. I didn't know that I had to try. I didn't know that I didn't know how much I would miss it if it was stripped away from me. And so your work is personally very timely. And I feel like I'm not alone. Having talked about this on the show with previous guests and in the micro shows that I do, I know this is a topic for our listeners. Would you please tell us that we're not alone? And would you please help us understand how we got here and where the heck we're going?
You're not alone. None of us are alone in this experience. First of all, a lot of solidarity, only child, fan of Legos myself as well. And also, interestingly, similar pattern. My wife is a super introvert. At least I thought of myself as quite extroverted before the pandemic. And I felt like I was really, in saran wrap, just separated from the social contact that I loved. And then I remember distinctly after lockdown sort of abated, returning to Stanford and to Palo Alto for the first time in over a year and walking down one of the main drags in this town and seeing an acquaintance of mine. And it was the first time that I would have run into somebody who I knew but didn't know very well. And I thought, this is it. I've been waiting for this moment to just run into somebody. And as they're approaching on the sidewalk, mind you, they don't see me, but I've seen them. I've clocked them probably 100 feet away. And it's getting to 90, 80, 70 feet. Now we're 50 feet apart. And I think, wait a minute, I actually don't want this. And I had this sort of very miniature panic and ended up ducking into a cafe to avoid them and reeling, thinking, who is this person and what has happened to the Jamil who I knew, I think a lot of us went through this sense of new disconnection, and not just disconnection, but a sense that we didn't know how to connect any longer. I think this has also been a time of massive cynicism. So let me help your listeners understand they're also not alone if they're experiencing that. And we can define cynicism first. Cynicism is a theory about people. It's the idea that humanity in general is selfish, greedy, and dishonest. Now, that's not to say a cynic will deny that somebody could donate to charity or help a stranger. They might say, yeah, people do nice things, but either they're doing those things for ulterior motives, or that's a kind of thin surface covering who we really are, which is sort of hyper Darwinian competitive animals. And if you feel that way, you're also not alone. It turns out that cynicism has been on the rise for at least 50 years. In 1972, about half of Americans believed that most people can be trusted. By 2018, that had fallen to a third of Americans, a drop as big as the stock market experienced during the financial collapse of 2008. So we were in a trust deficit, a deficit in terms of our faith in each other before the pandemic. And being suddenly separated from one another and only seeing each other through electronic media did not help, because that's the exact place where cynicism thrives most of all.
That data is simultaneously makes a ton of sense and is terrifying to me. And presumably that's one of the reasons you have undertaken this work. So thank you. And the obvious question here is, so what do we do? Because I don't like that. I don't think that people are more comfortable. I think that is a benefit of this time in the human arc, that we should be more comfortable than ever before for, all sorts of reasons, medically, technologically. There's every indication that we ought to be. And I think there's some science to say that it is the safest time. It is there's less violent crime. All those things are true. And yet, if it's not true in your head and your heart, if your body sensations are not actually registering that feeling, then it's actually not true for you.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is essentially asking you to, I don't want to summarize your book in 60 seconds here, but I need to introduce the book, Hope for Cynics. What do we do? How do we get out of this? How do we lean into what I feel like is so critical right now? Just give me a window of hope.
Of course. I mean, this is the major question. I think that the story of cynicism, once you look closely at the science, which I've been doing for the last few years, is an incredibly hopeful story, because it turns out that our cynicism is often a miscalculation. It's a perception that turns out to be wrong in a bunch of demonstrable ways. So I want to get to that. I do think that if we take a kind of medical mystery approach to cynicism, though, before we can figure out the cure, we must understand the illness a little bit more, with a little bit more specificity. And I think that the example that you just gave, Chase, is a really insightful and perfect one. You talked about feeling unsafe in a safe world. And it turns out that's exactly what many of us are experiencing. Now, of course, there are millions of people who are desperately unsafe at this very moment. And I want to absolutely acknowledge that the real dangers that people face all around the world. But for the book, I combined some data from Pew, this polling firm, over the last 30 years, and the FBI. And it turns out that Pew has been asking people since 1990, do you think that violent crime around the US has increased, decreased, or stayed the same over the last year? They've done this poll 27 times. And in 25 of those 27 polls, the majority of Americans believed that crime was worse than the year before, when they believed it had been worse than the year before that, when they thought it was worse than the year before that. The image in our mind is one of a Gotham City level, Batman level crisis of violent crime. And of course, crime does occur and deserves to be noticed when it does. But if you pull FBI statistics from that same 30-year span, violent crime at a national level decreased by a full 50%. So absolutely just want to co-sign what you said and add some data to it, add some teeth there, that we absolutely are in a safer cultural moment when it comes to violence than we were. And we absolutely do not realize that. In fact, we think that the exact opposite is occurring. And I think it's a great way in to ask ourselves, where is this coming from? If we are misperceiving the world so much, what's happened here? And I think there's a couple of pieces here. I'll allude to them briefly, and if you want to zoom in on either one, I'm happy to. The first is what I would say is a survival instinct that has gone awry, which is known as negativity bias. So psychologists and neuroscientists have documented for a long time that people pay way more attention to potential harm than to the good stuff in life, right? We remember negative things that have happened to us more than positive things. We pay more attention visually to threats versus positive experiences. We make decisions more based on avoiding loss than pursuing gain. And we perceive people more based on the worst things that they do versus the best things that they do. And this is, again, I think, a really good instinct to have 100 or 150,000 years ago. I don't know that it serves us as well now. And I think that's especially true when you combine it with a media ecosystem that has learned through trial and error and through market research that what works for us to keep us attending, to keep us online, to keep us clicking, is to appeal to our negativity bias. So you have this ancient instinct kind of kindled with gasoline poured on it by an ultra-modern media system to really drive us to see the worst in the world and each other.
Sort of terrifying.
Yes, sorry for you asked for hope, and I gave you more reason to fear. But I promise we'll get to the good stuff in a bit.
Okay. Let's see here.
So part of my hesitation in sort of deciding where I want to take this is that I actually know some human beings who were largely like first names of people, met them, interacted with them, who essentially are credited behind the scenes, and credit is used loosely here, attributed, I will say, to making this a norm for recognizing the psychology and embedding it deeply into our media systems. And, social media, it's not a stretch, has been the radical accelerator of the awareness of this in media in general, because data is presented, there's inferred data when you are Nielsen ratings and you're calling people, what shows are you watching right now? Or newspapers, what are the most read stories? As soon as we have data that tell us exactly what people are reading, for how long, which images their eyeballs are fixated on, the negativity bias, that wiring at 150,000-year-old that was valuable then is not valuable now, that becomes really apparent. And so the people who study that information and then make new products based on it, I am simultaneously so sad and disappointed and just aware of that this is a thing. And yet, how did we not see it coming? And how do we now bolster ourselves from this in the future?
It's a great question. And, we could have seen it coming for at least a century, right? In San Francisco, where my family and I live, that's where yellow journalism began with William Randolph Hearst, right? This San Francisco Examiner, this paper that just gave salacious stories about corruption and greed. That was the first kind of micro targeting of eyeballs, right? And it was extraordinarily successful. Same with cable news, and now, of course, with the much more targeted work of social media platforms. What do we do here? I mean, I think that one place that I go is to understand that knowing ourselves is the first step towards changing ourselves, right? That knowledge truly is power when it comes to our own minds. There are so many ancient instincts that we have that we don't simply accept. A lot of times when I talk about negativity bias and the media system, people say, okay, so there's nothing that we can do then. We're stuck here. And I think, well, that's not what we say about racial bias. That's not what we say about gender bias. There are so many, that's not what we say when for instance, if you're hungry, you're much more likely to make an angry decision, including if you're a federal judge, right? You're more likely to sentence people harshly. You're more likely to make decisions from a punitive perspective when you're hungry. None of us say, well, the human body has been made to accept calories and to act differently when we're calorically in deficit versus surplus. I guess there's nothing we can do about that, right? We understand that our instincts aren't always right, and we interrogate those instincts. And we also understand that sometimes our instincts are played upon by other forces, and we try to be mindful about that as well. In my work, I try to separate two big concepts. One is cynicism, and the other is skepticism. And I know sometimes we use those words interchangeably. I'm trying to decouple them in our cultural language, right? Cynicism, again, is a lack of faith in people. Skepticism is a lack of faith in our assumptions. It's thinking like a scientist and being hungry for new data to support any conclusions that we draw. And unlike cynics, skeptics can learn very quickly from the world, can figure out who they can trust and who they can't. But I think one of the powerful things, at least for me as a recovering cynic myself, has been to point skepticism at my own cynicism, to question the conclusions that I draw. So if I meet somebody new and I find myself distrusting them, or if I see something on social media and I draw a blanket conclusion like every politician is awful, or I can't trust any media ever, I ask myself, well, wait a minute, Zaki, that's a pretty big claim. How do you defend that claim? What evidence do you have to support it? And just hitting the pause button on that mechanism, interrogating it, and sort of trying to defend my own position has made me much more inquisitive and has at least created a little buffer against that kind of knee-jerk cynical reaction.
Super insightful how to apply one to the other, and helpful. And that's really where I want to take our conversation now. We've been talking largely about it culturally, right? This is what's happening in the media landscape and in our modern time and with humanity. And I would like to now shift, if we can, to the individual, because right now there are people who are listening and watching and like, okay, cool. What do I do? How do I get out of this in order to make my life and the people around me, my kids, my friends, my peers, how do we escape from that? And, presumably there's a lens that you'll share about how to apply skepticism to cynicism. This is a point in the conversation where I want to share with you that I have just written a book as well. I want to, again, double down on Hope for Cynics, y'all, is an absolutely essential reading if you care about how you see the world. And if anything that Jamil is saying here resonates, like we need to get over this stuff. So essential reading. My book is called Never Play It Safe. And the lens that this is taking is directed at people who are listening and watching right now, who there's an understanding that, or there's a belief rather, and I would consider it a toxic belief that staying safe is the objective, when in fact, like all of the best things in life are on the other side of safety. And this is where, like you qualified, your POV in the beginning. I will say, I do not mean this is not about seatbelts and sunscreen and emotional safety and physical safety, for which there are, real bad things out there in the world. I'm talking about the belief in oneself and where we find nurturing, where we find connection, where we find trust and belonging and all this stuff. And so I'm wondering if, through this lens of, again, I've already introduced the book to my listeners, they will be familiar with it, but I'm wondering if does our work reconcile at all around those things, and through the lens of the individual rather than culturally, because it's easy for us to get overwhelmed culturally, like, oh my gosh. But what do we do as individuals? How do we embrace this application of skepticism to our own cynicism?
I love this idea. The book sounds brilliant, and I think we're completely aligned here.
Just luckily well-timed, drafting off of your wisdom for sure.
We're so aligned here, Chase. So one of the things that I express in in the book is solidarity with and compassion for cynics. The last thing that we need to do is be cynical towards cynics. They're suffering enough. I know I suffer a lot when I go through bouts of cynicism. This is, I think in our culture, cynicism often has this kind of sneering superiority to it, where people are kind of have a bitter pride and they feel really smart for being cynical. But if you actually explore how cynics often feel, they're looking for safety, as exactly in line with what you're talking about. And oftentimes it's because they have felt unsafe in the past. So George Carlin once said, "Scratch a cynic and you'll find a disappointed idealist." And it turns out that a lot of people who have trouble trusting others, it's because they maybe weren't securely attached as kids, or they've been through betrayal in the past. And it's completely natural after that hurt, after that pain, to not want to experience it again. The problem is that pain, and especially social pain, like betrayal, can be too good a teacher, right?
Yeah.
We say, I want to avoid that so badly that I will lock my life down in order to never feel that way again. I call it going from being disappointed in a person to becoming pre-disappointed in all people, right?
Mhm.
The idea being that, well, if I want to ensure that I'm not betrayed, then the only thing that I can do that will guarantee that outcome is to never put my faith in anybody else again, to not be vulnerable again. It's like an abstinence only model of
Right.
social engagement. And yeah, that could be considered safe in the way that being under house arrest is safe, right? You might not get
Love
hurt,
that.
but you'll almost certainly lose the things that most of us cherish in life: connection, love, collaboration, discovery, which all exists. Well, I would say exactly as it sounds like you write about, when you take chances. And I would just add to that, in the social world, when you're willing to take chances on other people, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's, for me, I try to really be aware of the cost of safety, because right, when you trust somebody and it's a mistake, man, you feel that betrayal, you remember it for years. But when you don't trust somebody and that's a mistake, when you miss out on an opportunity, it's invisible. So I try to make the invisible visible by focusing on, well, what could I gain by taking a chance here? And what will I lose if I don't take a chance, right? What could I lose? I think just being aware, trying to shift that calculus is a little bit helpful. The other thing that I'll add, and I really want to hear your thoughts on this because I think we're singing the same song here, is
It's crazy how it's so good. I'm getting chills.
no, I think it's great to meet a fellow traveler in this way. But the last thing I'll say on this point for now is that it's also not just about us, the person trusting, the person taking a chance. It's about the effects that the chances we take on others have on them. So a lot of work in economics and psychology suggests that our beliefs are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? If you believe in somebody, you will put faith in them. They will see that you've put faith in them and they will step up. It's what's known as earned trust in economics. So, from a very simple economic game perspective, if you invest money in somebody else and they have the chance to pay you back, the more you invest in them, the more percentage of that investment that they'll pay back to you. The return on investment of trust is enormous because people reciprocate. And if we instead decide, man, everybody's out to get me or just out for themselves, I'm going to just hold back, I'm not going to trust people, other people can tell that you're feeling that way. They can tell in the distant ways that you respond to them and in the little faith you put in them. And if people reciprocate trust, they retaliate against mistrust. So if you're cynical, you end up ironically bringing out the worst in other people and becoming right in your cynicism. And if you have faith in people, if you're hopeful, you end up bringing out the best in other people and being right as well. So I think to myself, not just what am I giving up when I don't trust, but what good could I do for this person? What good could I bring out of them if I choose to take a chance instead? Just that little leap of faith.
Man, where were you when I was researching all this stuff? You just described so many things that I care so much about in the most eloquent way. Early in the book, you talk about, and again, just the book, Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. So early in the book, you talk about these myths, and we're essentially sort of scraping away at some of these myths right now in our conversation. And you also talk about, I think the way you put it, is something like, once we understand the illness, we can actually find a cure. We can pursue a cure. And so if this exploration that we've been going through for the past, 30 minutes here is really an excavation of the illness, is it simply a product of trusting in ourselves and essentially in others, as you said, like that reciprocity, that sort of the planting good seeds and expecting good things as opposed to the other way around? Is it really that simple? And what can we expect? I'll just share anecdotally the way that I approach this topic is, hey, look, it's not about not falling prey to a lack of trust or a lack of a desire for playing it safe in my language. Because again, we're wired, we're working against tens of thousands of years of biology and all of those things. But not dissimilar to meditation, how, look, the goal of meditation, or the way that meditation works, is it's not to believe that your mind will never wander, because 100% of meditators' minds wander, and people who practice this for a lifetime and people who teach it know this. So the act is actually not about, it's sort of about, not about avoiding mistakes. It's about recovering as quickly as you can. And so my belief is that our goal ought to be to come back to ourselves, to allow the betrayal and just come back 1% faster and 1% more authentic every time. And that over time, asymptotically, we are approaching our goal. So if we have diagnosed the illness and you're saying that now we can sort of treat it, is it, do you align with my belief of like, look, this never goes away. This is so hardwired into us. And yet, if we can actually acknowledge that we can't escape it, let's just get really freaking good at recognizing it in ourselves and others such that we can call it out. And that's where awareness, or our ability to direct our attention, matters most.
1,000%. I think that's exactly the way that I try to get people to think. There's a mindset that I suggest in the book, which is hopeful skepticism, right? And the idea here is that we are in no way suggesting replacing cynicism, mistrust, and safetyism, right? Psychological safetyism, almost the fetishizing of being safe as the most important quality of our mental lives. We're not suggesting to replace that with the opposite, which would be unthinking, naive trust of everybody, being gullible and turning into a chump and a rube and being taken advantage of and being totally unsafe all the time. That would be ridiculous, right? I think, Chase, it sounds like both you and I are advocating for a middle ground, right? That and from my perspective, in the world of cynicism and hope, the middle ground is not to naively think that everything is awesome. Of course not. There's this famous modern cartoon of a dog sitting in a room that's on fire, saying, "This is fine." We're not trying to be the dog saying this is fine. This is not fine. There are so many things that are not fine in our world. And if you don't feel fine, that is 100% understandable. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think that just as unthinkingly, naively trusting people is a terrible mistake, so is unthinkingly and naively mistrusting people, right? There are all sorts of problems in our world, but the minute that we decide we are the problem, our species is a write-off, well, then there's no place to go. There's nothing to be done, and there's nothing that we can do as individuals either. Instead, skepticism, again, is this openness to evidence. And the reason that I think of hopeful skepticism as important is because negativity bias, right, our tendency to focus on the worst aspects of our lives and other people, means that our default, if we're skeptical, is to pick up evidence in a little bit of a biased way, right? If you're a skeptic, you're trying to take in evidence about the world. You're trying to integrate it so you can be fluid, right? So that you can return after a good experience or a bad experience to an open and inquisitive mind and adapt as well as you can. And a skeptic should adapt. If they're at a poker table, they should not trust the people around them. That would be ridiculous. If they're with their family and their family has a history of having affectionate and supportive bonds, they should absolutely trust the people in that room. And then they should, in other rooms, look to see, well, which type of room am I in? What type of relationship is this? They should adapt. Now, being a skeptic in view of the tens of thousands of years, millions of years of evolution that we're working with, means that we're going to pick up negative information more than positive, which sounds terrible. As you were saying, it sounds a little bit depressing, but there's great news underneath that bad news, which is that if you pay closer attention, if you take a more mindful look at the evidence and at the people around you, a lot of them are probably better than you think, right? I mean, the average person underestimates the average person. And by this, I do not mean that there aren't cheaters and scoundrels
Sure,
and
yeah.
people hurting each other all over the world. But in study after study, over decades of science now, people don't realize how trustworthy, generous, open-minded, warm, and supportive other people are. And what that means is that when we adopt hopeful skepticism, we can understand as we pay attention to the world that our defaults are a little bit negative and hold that hope that probably things are better than we think. That to me is a recipe for being adaptive and adaptable, building relationships and communities, but also being, I think, relatively safe insofar as not just, being so open-minded that our brains fall out of our skulls.
And I love that. I also have not heard as an elegant a use of the word chump.
As you threw in there a while ago. That's so good. I haven't heard the word chump in a long time, and
I love it. So, in the appendix, which is a practical guide to hopeful skepticism, this way of being that you have encouraged, which I find incredibly uplifting, and in many of the ways you've just described. You talk about, I think that there's a monk that you reference, and this is the first chapter of my book is around attention. And so, in the same way that you look at sort of diagnosing the illness, what role does awareness play? Clearly, a little bit, because you referenced the monk being able to basically know, to be able to be still for a second, create a little space between stimulus and response, for example, to reference Stoic philosophy. Like, to what is that the core of this, to be able to catch yourself in the moment when you are falling prey to skepticism, to your biology, to popular culture, to the media? Like, what's the most important skill for this interruption and, a movement toward hopeful skepticism?
Yeah, I think cynicism is ultimately, I think, a mistake that we make in our minds. And so the solution must come from there as well, right? At least it must start there. The monk that you refer to is the great monk and writer Pema Chodron. And in one of her books, she says, we can treat our lives a little bit more like an experiment. We can pause the usual cycle and observe more intently what's happening inside us and between us as well, I would add, right? And I think absolutely that's where I try to begin, and where I think a hopeful skeptic can begin. We've been talking about ways to interrogate our cynical beliefs, to ask ourselves, what evidence do I have for this? We've also talked about, I think, one great way of saying, well, can I collect better evidence? And one way to do that is to take these leaps of faith on people, right? And I'm not saying you have to share your bank information with a prince who's going to wire you $14 million or anything like that, right? This is more small, calculated risks that we take on other people to see what they show us, right? And remember that what the risk that you take on somebody else will also change what they show you. If you put faith in them, and to the degree that you do, they will probably reflect that back to you. But I think, to your point, another critical part of this is not just to do stuff, but to reflect as we do stuff, to be open to the evidence that comes in. Because one really easy place to land is that you put faith in somebody and they come through for you and you say, oh, that was nice. And then you kind of forget it. And then you do that 10 more times and you forget all 10 of them. And then you do it once more and it goes poorly and you remember that for the rest of your life, right? I mean, I have this with my teaching evaluations. I teach a 500-person class at Stanford, and typically something like 490 of the course reviews are positive. And then, of course, 3 weeks later, I'm trying to fall asleep and I'm thinking about the one negative review, like, what problem does this person have with that shirt? What? I can't choose what shirt I wear? Come on, I'm a grown man. So I think that we have this tendency, even if we are collecting good data, to not record it very well. And that's where I think deep awareness comes in. One thing that I did that I write about in the book and that I encourage other people to do, I call encounter counting. That is, treat your experiences with other people, I'm not saying forever, but say for a day or a week, like a field experiment. Put faith in people, take chances in people, whether that's striking up a conversation with a stranger, confiding in an acquaintance, giving somebody at work some responsibility that you normally wouldn't give them, just trusting them. Do it loudly. Tell them, hey, I've got a lot of faith in you, or I really trust you, so I'm going to bring this up. I hope that's okay. But then don't just let the situation play out. Write down how it played out. Write down, and even better, bonus points, before you put faith in somebody. Write down how you think it will go, and then write down afterwards how it actually went. It turns out that in dozens of studies in social psychology, when people ask folks to forecast what a conversation will be like, where they ask for support or try to connect with a stranger or express gratitude or whatever, they ask people to forecast what those conversations will be like. Then they have a separate group of people actually have those conversations. And the two are worlds apart. People imagine that their conversations with others will be cringeworthy and awkward and terrible and not very productive. People who actually have those conversations, sometimes reluctantly, end up thrilled that they occurred. So there's a disjunction between what we expect and reality. And it's a positive disjunction. Mm-hmm. We don't realize how good things will be. So don't just have those conversations. Try to pay close attention so that you're less surprised the next time. Try to bring your expectations up, not above reality. Don't be overly optimistic, but bring them up from where they are, which is probably overly pessimistic, up to something more accurate.
Mm. I love that. I think about things in terms of tiny experiments, like how expensive is it to run that experiment? And the answer is it costs very little. Costs, as you said, 90 seconds of your time to write down what you think is going to happen, go run the experiment, and then, you get data. And that data, the way that I like to think about this is inertia. Like it builds, assuming you get, because of, I'll just reference the science, it's disproportionately positive. And especially once you have that expectation, that velocity likely will increase. So there's this a belief in, once you look closely, that even as a skeptic, like you said, bringing skepticism to cynicism, the math says, the science says that be prepared to be surprised in an amazing way. And to me, this is the core message of the book. This is why it's hopeful. And it doesn't take that much effort to bring awareness to these things.
Yes.
Think about the world working for you they're happening for you rather than to you, as an example.
I love that point. And I kind of want to double down on it a little bit.
Please do.
I think you're exactly right that a book about cynicism sounds like, well, maybe it could leave you feeling cynical. But again, I think that there's a giant secret underlying all of this, which is that we don't have to feel this way. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with cynics, but it's just, this is a natural response from our biased mind to a world that is much better than we realize it is. And I think that what I want to do is give people freedom to pay closer attention. And, to that point, we talked about this data on perceptions of violence versus actual violence. And it turns out that there's a cutout in that data set that I think is so important. So if you ask Americans, is violent crime around the country better, worse, or the same than it is last year. As I said, people see violence escalating even when it wasn't. But if you ask people, what about in your neighborhood, in your community? People do not think that violence is escalating in their own community. If you ask people, do you think most human beings can be trusted? Most of them say no. If you ask people, can the folks in your community be trusted? Most of them say yes. On our screens, we are cynical because we are fed all this cynical information. But hope resides not on our screens, but in our real lives and in the people around us. So the more that, and again, that's where we collect the best data. The best data you can collect about people is not doom scrolling on a never-ending social media feed. It's having real conversations with real people. And that's, I think, a natural, I mean, I know it sounds really simple, but it's a natural almost fountain for a more hopeful and more accurate perspective is to go away from media systems that are driving our negativity bias towards real conversation.
A dear friend of mine, Dr. Brene Brown, is very, very articulate on this point and says it's hard to hate up close.
Yes.
And I just find that to be so medicinal when, your experience of someone at the coffee shop, oh, I screwed up your drink. I'm happy to make it again, as whatever happened this morning for me. And it's like, wow, that's cool. That person's really busy. And they're not like, oh, fuck, what am I doing? Blah, blah, and they're just like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, man, that's really kind. I'm like, I'll take whatever drink just because you were so thoughtful about and gracious how you realized the mistake. And, to me, that's like as I said earlier, what your work, it just brings a tremendous amount of hope. So let's get to a prescription. Prescribe for those of, folks who are listening and watching right now. What is the path? Is it, does it include turning off our phones? Does it include doubling down on these places where we do feel safe and then trying to extend that again, 1%, each day or each mile away from the center of gravity of our life to, and to finally have it cover the whole world? Like, what's the prescription from the good Dr. Jamil?
It's multifaceted. And I think some of this we've already covered. We've covered some of the ground,
Sure.
but maybe we can kind of synthesize here.
Yeah, make a tidy list for us.
I think the first is so I'll give a list in 3 parts. 1 is around our mindset, 2 is about our action, and 3 is about our influence over other people. So when it comes to our mindset, I think, again, a couple of things that we can do, and you point this out nicely, is to go where we feel safe. Maybe don't start online. Maybe start with your local, right? Think globally, trust locally, at least to begin, right? I think that interrogating and being skeptical of our cynicism and actually auditing our thoughts, right? Saying not trusting our instinct all the time, but thinking like scientists and saying, well, what evidence do I have for this conclusion? Oftentimes, it's probably not enough evidence. So if you don't have enough data, try to collect some new data. Treat your life like an experiment. And the way to do that is to put faith in other people, right? To take leaps of faith on them. When you do so, I think that if you want to have the greatest impact on another person and also bring out their best, one thing that you can do is trust loudly, right? To not keep your faith in them a secret. And I know maybe it sounds corny, but it means the world to people. If you say, hey, I've got this thing that's going on with me. Can we talk about it? I really believe in you and I trust you a lot. So I'd love to hear your opinion. That is an incredibly powerful sentence. So use those sentences. Express your faith in people when you're choosing to put it in them. And then afterwards, I would say, don't just let those experiments occur. Try to record your findings. And especially when things go better than you expect, savor that difference, right? It's so easy to just let that slip away. Remember that, hold that in your mind, and try to update your worldview based on your positive experiences as well as your negative ones. And then a last piece that I'll add, which we haven't talked about yet, is how we can spread hopeful skepticism beyond ourselves. And here I turn to what I would call positive gossip, right? I mean, oftentimes we don't just think negatively about each other, we speak negatively about each other. We love giving 1-star Yelp reviews of humanity, and that's a natural thing to do. And it can win us some points, some clout, even if we're doing it online. But it's damaging to ourselves, and it builds other people's cynicism. So what I try to do and encourage others to do is to gossip about positive things, catch people in the act of kindness, generosity, openness, and call them out, right? I mean, share what you've seen. I do this with my kids all the time. I try to give them at least one positive piece of gossip per day. And I found that that doesn't just help them, I hope, but I know it helps me, right? Because when you need to talk about something, you pay a lot of attention to it. And for me, if I know that, well, I'm at work today, I'm going to go home and I want to have something good to tell my kids about something that somebody else did. Well, I'm on a mission then. I'm looking for that type of evidence. And guess what? Once you're looking for it, it is not hard to find. There are helpers everywhere. And so for me, a habit of speech, getting ready to talk about human goodness, turns into a habit of mind, noticing it more systematically. So those three pieces, right, our mindsets, building that hopeful skepticism, our actions, taking calculated leaps of faith on other people and recording what we get back, and then our influence on others through sharing and positive gossip in particular. I think that's the beginning of a recipe for overcoming cynicism at the micro level. And then I think the more of us who do that, the more we can find solidarity with each other and try to fight cynicism at a broader level as well.
Mm. There's a beautiful story in the book, and it's about ripples. And what I'm hearing as you're sharing this is essentially, use your ripples wisely, be the beacon. And that is a prescription that I think do it for yourself, but also do it do it for the people that you have a chance to help find their way. That's the way out of this mess, right? Is to be the ripples that you want to see in the world. I don't know, it's mixed metaphors, but I'm going to lean into it.
My late friend, Emile Bruneau, who is
Yes.
really the hero of this book, he was one of the most hopeful people I ever knew, despite living a very difficult life. And he talked about his hope not as something that was just given to him or granted to him by, a bunch of privilege and naivete, but something that he chose. He said, any of us can walk through darkness and spread light. And that's what he did in his short life. And I think any of us can do that. We all have been through our own shades and shadows of darkness. And we have a choice to make. Do we want those experiences to define us? Or do we want to leave something else for ourselves, for the people in our lives, and for the world? And I think that's one of the most important choices each of us has to make.
Mm. The force each of us exerts, felt in small ways at great distances. That's how you talk about ripples on the last page of the book. It's absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for writing this book, for it's so timely, and the spirit in it is massive. It's so heart forward and yet brilliant, backed by science, and your perspective is really, it is hopeful. So I'm grateful for the work. I cannot speak highly enough of this book. I believe that everyone who is listening and watching should purchase it because we need this now more than ever. Again, the title of the book is Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. Dr. Jamil Zaki, thank you so much for being on the show. Is there anyone else you would like to direct, speaking of directing our attention and managing it, is there anywhere else you'd like to point us in order to connect more with you or your work? Or
first of all, Chase, this has been absolutely delightful. It's great speaking with somebody who just gets it, and I feel like we're on such similar missions. The book is available wherever they're sold, and I hope that it's useful to many people. My lab is the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab, and we are at ssnl.stanford.edu. If you are a nerd and want to really dig into everything that we do, first of all, Nerds Unite, we're right there with you, and you can find all of our scientific publications there. And I'm on various social media platforms at Zaki Jam, ZAKIJAM, but I'm not super active there, but happy to hear from folks.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And from Dr. Jamil and myself, we both bid you an awesome day. Thanks for listening and watching. Until next time.